Racing Through Time is the story of the drivers, the cars, the teams and the famous circuits that made motorsport history. In the history of Grand Prix racing, only one driver has ever won the World Championship driving a car of his own manufacture, and that man was Sir Jack Brabham. Racing Through Time looks at the remarkable career of the triple world champion and the Repco Brabham era. Jack's story is unique. He was from the age of practical racing drivers, more interested in building and engineering cars than living the high life. John Arthur Brabham began his career in the rough and tumble world of speedway, building his own cars and developing his trademark tail-out style. He was Australian midget champion from 1948 to 1951 before moving to hill climbs.
When I started road racing and left the speedway, I started with a Mark IV Cooper that had a HRD engine, and then I moved up into a Mark V Cooper with a 1100 engine, and the last 2 years before I came here I had a Cooper Bristol, and unfortunately I sold that car before I left and came over here thinking that I'd be able to buy a better car here, but it didn't quite work out like that. Because of my association with Coopers in Australia, if you like, I was driving the car. When I came to England in 1955, naturally, I went to have a look and see where those cars were built, and met John Cooper, and we've had a wonderful association ever since.
Before settling in with Cooper, Jack did make one mistake.
Big mistakes I made was buying a Maserati 250F, and I tried to run that on my own, looking after it myself, which was more than I could do. But luckily, John Cooper came up with an arrangement where I could drive for them, and I drove for Coopers for quite some time after that.
John and Charles Cooper had established themselves with the Cooper 500 and were the main racing car manufacturers in England in the early 1950s.
We started building these rear-engine sports cars, which were driven by Sterling Moss and Jack Brabham in those days, and Ivor Boer. And it was the original one was a light aluminium fire pump engine, and which started off as an 1100 and then finished up as a 1500, and then we persuaded them to build bigger engines. And Jack decided that he had already raced a Cooper Bristol with a front engine and won I think he'd won the Australian Grand Prix, and it was called the Red X Special, the front engine Cooper Bristol. And he decided to put a Bristol engine in the back of one of the, virtually one of our sports cars really. And his first race was at Aintree at the Grand Prix, where he finished, I think it was about 6th, but he took it over to Australia and won the Australian Grand Prix with it.
The real breakthrough in Jack Brabham's Grand Prix career came at Monaco in 1957. Roy Salvadori had signed for BRM, but early in 1957, while testing at Goodwood, he'd suggested to Rob Walker that the size of the 1.5-litre Coventry Climax engine in the back of the Formula 2 Cooper could be increased to 2 litres, and this would be the ideal car for Monaco. He couldn't drive it himself, so Jack Brabham was the man chosen to give the car its debut race. This was the year in which Moss, Collins and Hawthorne crashed in the early laps, and Brabham's race was also in doubt after an accident in practice. But the parts were rebuilt into Les Leston's Formula 2 chassis, and so the Cooper was able to start the race. Jack drove brilliantly and brought the car into a podium position. 4 laps from the end, it broke down, and a determined Jack had to push the car over the finish line in 6th place.
I certainly had no idea we were going to go as far as we did, but any sort of motor racing was something I liked doing at the time. I certainly didn't have it in my mind that I was going to be world champion, or that was what I was really working for. I was really loved my motor racing, and that's really what I wanted to do.
At the end of 1958, Roy Salvadori moved on, and Brabham was joined at Cooper by another driver from the Antipodes, Bruce McLaren.
I'm only sorry he's not still with us, because he's a great character, Bruce. And we thought when we'd got the Packer 2.5 litre engine, which would be for 59, that we had a good chance of at least possibly winning 1 or 2 Grand Prix, you know, or getting somewhere near. It was wonderful when we actually won the World Championship that year. Great. It was marvellous, you know. And the engine was so reliable. The gearbox wasn't, because we had our own modified Fiat gearbox, Citroen gearbox, sorry, in those years. And it wasn't until the following year, when we had our own complete design gearbox in the 60, that it was so much better.
Cooper made full use of the Wally Hassan-designed aluminium fire pump engine that became the mainstay for British teams in the late 50s and early 1960s.
Coventry Climax made the wonderful 2.5 litre 4-cylinder Grand Prix engine, and that really put Coopers on the right track. 1959, 1960, we had a wonderful 2 seasons, winning the championship both years with that Coventry Climax engine.
Jack also played a big part in helping Bruce McLaren secure his drive with Cooper.
Well, actually, I was the one who brought Bruce McLaren over here, really, because in New Zealand they had a driver to Europe scheme, and Bruce actually won that. And of course, that only gave him an airfare to England, so that's not a lot of good to people coming from that way. Getting over here is only half the battle. When you get here, you've got to be able to get in somewhere to drive, and I was able to, at that time, get him in with Coopers because Roy had gone off to drive with Aston Martin, and I became the #1 driver there in place of Roy, and Bruce McLaren, of course, you know, was very, very successful with me.
1959 was a year of change in Grand Prix racing, with the withdrawal of Van Wall and Maserati, the retirement of Fangio, Mike Hawthorne, and the passing of Peter Collins. At Monaco in 1959, Jack Brabham scored his first Grand Prix victory after an intense race. The British Grand Prix at Aintree was the second win for the Australian. No one could catch Jack as he led every one of the 75 laps around the famous racetrack, Moss just finishing ahead of McLaren on the line to take second place. By now, the championship challenge for 1959 was looking good for Cooper. The final race of the year was at Sebring in the USA. Either Brabham, Moss or Ferrari's Tony Brooks could win the title. Brooks pitted for loose bodywork, Moss dropped out with gearbox troubles, and Jack Brabham ran out of fuel on the last lap. Bruce McLaren sped past to win his first Grand Prix, the youngest driver ever to do so. John Cooper showed his gymnastic skills and then realised that Jack hadn't come past. Jack pushed his car across the line into 4th place, an exhausted but happy 1959 world champion.
Well, yes, I knew I had to get across the line with the car, and of course I led the race right up to the last 500 or 600 yards, and because the car ran out of petrol, and I had to push it over the last few yards over the line, and but it did clinch the championship for me, so it was worth pushing. It was uphill too.
Fair enough, we did win the World Championship in 59 on the last race with Jack. Although Jack ran out of fuel and Bruce finished third, but Jack still managed to win the World Championship. But then we went to in fact, Bruce won that Sebring race, the American Grand Prix, and he was the youngest Grand Prix driver ever to win a race, a Grand Prix, and I think that still stands. He was 21. And in January, we went to the Argentine Grand Prix, which was the first race of the 1960 season. We're still with the 59 cars, of course. And Bruce won that race as well. So he was then the youngest driver ever to lead the World Championship, which was rather nice. But at that race, Lotuses had produced a rear-engine car, their first rear-engine car. Innes Ireland was driving it. And it was very light. It was probably quite a bit lighter than ours, not as strong as our car, mind you. And it was very quick, and it worried Jack very much, and Bruce. But although Bruce did win the race because it broke, and on the way home in the aeroplane, we virtually said, we really redesign the whole motor car for 1960.
Coming back from the Argentine in the aeroplane, John and I were sitting together, of course, and we had our pencils and sketches out and decided on all the changes that we should make to the existing car. And it was when we went to a 4-coil spring suspension, and the car was very, very much lower and more streamlined, and I think was probably the most successful car we had.
And the gearbox was already being made because that had been a year on the drawing board, and we'd made the gearbox was nearly ready, the new gearbox, to replace the Citroen type gearbox. And we made a much lower car with a different suspension, the proper wishbone coil spring suspension on the back, and the driver laid back more in the car, and it handled a lot better, and I think the 60s car was a great car, really. In fact, I know Jack managed to have an accident at Monaco with the car, but he won the next 5 Grand Prix in a row, which wasn't bad.
Not bad indeed, as Jack and the Cooper blitzed the opposition. Those wins in 1960 came in the Dutch, Belgian, French, British and Portuguese Grand Prix. Jack won his second World Championship. Bruce McLaren came second, and Cooper won the manufacturer's title for the second year in a row. And this was the peak of the team's achievements.
Well, in 1961, unfortunately, they changed the formula on us, and we were all set up going very well on the 2.5 litre formula. When it went to 1.5 litre, we were on a back foot really, because the 1.5 litre engine to start with gave a lot of trouble, and it was just unreliable compared with the 2.5 litre one. But having said that, it was just a bad year for us really.
We found that the 1.5 litre formula, for our point of view, was much more difficult than the 2.5 litre formula. Our cars had much bigger advantage against others with the 2.5 litre engine than they did with the 1.5 litre, and people are beginning to catch us up with rear engine cars by then.
In 1961, Jack Brabham took the 2.5 litre Cooper to Indianapolis and easily qualified in his rookie test. His 9th place in the nimble car introduced the rear-engine revolution in America, consigning roadsters to the museum.
1961 really was the last year I had with Coopers, and at that time I was very keen to have either moved in and joined Coopers or go off and do our own thing. And the decision was made to go and build our own car, which we started in 1962. Well, I think the fact that I was driving with Coopers and was able to win the World Championship twice with them, and then having the car building design side of it very, very much in my mind, and something I wanted to get involved in even more so than I could with Coopers, the decision was made to go off and do that. And of course, once I'd done that, to win the World Championship in our own car was really the ambition from there on.
I had 2 drivers at that time that were both first-class engineers, first class at setting their car up. And let's face it, they must have been very good indeed, because when they left me, they both built cars and won the World Championship. So either my training was good or they taught me something.
So Jack Brabham set out to build his own Grand Prix and production racing cars, growing from the already successful garage business he started shortly after his arrival in England. Brabham was involved with the tuning of road cars and racing cars like the Lotus Elite. Australian automotive engineering company Repco provided equipment and support for the venture. Jack called on a rival from his early racing days to join the company and design the cars.
First car I ever drove in Australia was one I built myself anyway, so it was really going back to what I'd originally done. And I had a very good friend in Australia by the name of Ron Toranak, who, as you know, today is one of the best designers in this country. And I brought him over to Australia and we joined forces together, and we finished up with a very good team, and we've done very well.
All the cars were prefixed BT, although Jack didn't want to use his name on the cars. That changed when it was pointed out that the initials of Motor Racing Developments, MRD, didn't sound the best in French. All the Brabhams were safe and strong.
I suppose it's my conservatism coming out. We built very successful space frame cars, and one had to learn a new technology and get, on top of that, you had to get all new machinery to do the sheet metal type thing. And I tend to hold back doing anything that I don't understand. When I do it, I've finally got to grips with it, and therefore the first of any new product usually works very well. Yes, Jack was a tinkerer. He liked, because he was part of the company as well, he was always, he was my best turner, I would say. If I wanted to do a development job, I only had to have the idea and a little bit of a sketch, and Jack would hop on the lathe and make it. Whereas if anyone else did it, it needed proper drawings. He had a very good feel for the car also, and we worked quite well technically.
Frank Gardner was another engineer-driver from Australia who built a successful career in Britain. The legendary raconteur worked at and drove for Brabham.
Yeah, it was a great era, a different era. It wasn't the high-tech era today. You didn't have telemetry coming out your ears and technicians and stuff like that. It was, and Jack got his championship through being a basic, practical thinker. The man thought the state of the art for what it was at that point in time, and the cars were probably, you had to have a Brabham to beat a Brabham. So I was very fortunate in sitting in one of the very few cars that were capable of winning. And there was plenty of them out there from the Coopers onwards to Lolas and what have you, but for that era, you certainly had to sit in a Brabham.
Success eluded Brabham in 1962 in Grand Prix racing, although he did manage fourth place in South Africa. In 1963, American all-rounder Dan Gurney joined Jack in the team. In that year, they scored 3 second places. 1964 proved to be even better. The cars were competitive throughout the year. Early in the season, Gurney had proved that by beating Jim Clark in practice in Holland and in Belgium. He carried that through to win the French Grand Prix at Rouen. The British Grand Prix in 1964 was at Brands Hatch, and much was expected of Gurney and Brabham. By now, Jack was letting the talented American get on with the racing. And it was Gurney who led the challenge to Clark, Hill and Surtees. Unfortunately, he had a pit stop and dropped back out of the running. Jack took over fourth place behind Clark, who went on to win, Graham Hill, who was in second place, and John Surtees' Ferrari, who finished third. It was still a far cry from winning every race and dominating Grand Prix racing, but Brabham now was very much a team to be reckoned with. Brands Hatch was always one of Jack's favourite circuits. Here he proved that he was still competitive. But the load of running the team and being part designer of the cars had taken some of the edge off his driving. Compared to BRM, to Lotus and Ferrari, the Brabham team didn't have as much money to spend, but they remained competitive throughout the season. At the age of 38, many were wondering if Jack had seen his best days as a driver. They were to find out that there was still life in Black Jack. The national anthem had been heard by Brabham for their first win in Grand Prix racing in that year at the French Grand Prix at Rouen. Rouen Circuit had been expected to be a walkover for Lotus or BRM, but here, on a track that Gurney knew and liked, he proved that Brabham was a match for anything, taking the team to their first ever Grand Prix victory. A young Mike Halewood watches the spoils of victory going to the tall Dan Gurney. They remained competitive with Lotus and BRM finishing on a high note with a win in the Mexican Grand Prix, the last race of the season.
The cars were brilliant. The Ron Tornak designed, Brabham assisted and tested cars. They were the best of that era. And we had a lot of success. The only failures were driver failures. Putting your helmet on and leaving your brains in the pit and stuff like that were the main bloody causes of retirements, because the state of the art of those things were very good. They were easy cars to drive in the wet, which there was plenty of in that part of the world. We had good tyres, good contracts. It was all practical stuff. There was no complications. You could think your way through your whole program, and it all worked.
Another New Zealander, Denny Hulme, made his debut for Brabham in 1963.
I was working for Jack at the time in the garage in Hook Road in Chessington, just as a grease ball. Probably wandered around bare feet as well. It was all a bit of a joke in those days. But I remember the driver that he had was an Australian, and they tested the new car, and they built this new little Formula Junior quite secretly, and they'd been testing, I think, down Brands Hatch, and he flipped the car up and broke his collarbone. And they could fix the car and not the collarbone. So Jack said, well, you better take your helmet to Crystal Palace and you can have the little Junior for the weekend. And I'm going off to Alton Park, so I got the car in pole position. I think I finished third or fourth in the race. I spun it and hit the straw bales and still finished. So Jack said, oh, you better join the team consistently or full-time in the new year of 1963, which I went to Brands Hatch, Boxing Day, and it snowed during the race, but I won the first genuine race, or the first race that Brabham had ever won on that particular day.
Jack was the ideal person to be mixed up with. I can remember we had a stage where we had all kinds of people around us. Brian Muir, who was no longer with us, and Brian was chief transport driver, cook, bottle washer, the whole bit. And it wasn't an uncommon thing to be at a race meeting, being a big budget team. I can remember being at a couple of race meetings with nobody to change gear ratios except myself, nobody to change engines except myself, nobody to give pit signals except myself, and nobody to drive except myself. So, it was a pretty efficient team, really. We were quite lucky to arrive because we'd been up all night. The most hazardous part of the operation was getting a transporter to the circuit.
And what about driving for Brabham in 1966?
Well, Jack had let me drive for him in the Tasman series. He sent a couple of cars down there at various Christmases. So I had a little bit of experience. And then in 65 I got a couple of drives in a Cooper and the Brabham Climax. And in 66 it was full time. He'd said to me, Dan Gurney's leaving to go and construct his own cars and you'll be slotting into the team. So there I did. I slotted in the team in 66 and 67. So I felt that I did fairly well in 3 years in Formula One and you're world champion. I tell you, it's a lot harder than that nowadays for any of the drivers to do that. So it was very good.
1966 was a brilliant year for Brabham. Dan Gurney's departure in 66 to build his own cars hadn't blunted the team's attack at all, and Jack proved that he was driving better than ever.
1966 was the start of the 3-litre formula. That was the first year, and I could see that we really didn't have an engine. Coventry Climax didn't have an engine for us and didn't intend building an engine for us, so we had to look elsewhere. And I had looked myself for perhaps 2 years looking for some sort of engine, knowing that the new formula was coming. And I went to Japan and looked at V8 cylinder blocks over there, and I finished up with an American cylinder block from an Oldsmobile, and decided that'd be a good block to build an engine around. And I had a lot of contacts in Australia, of course, with Repco. And Repco, I went to them with a proposition and they decided, yes, they'd build an engine for me. and that's how it started. It was really an Oldsmobile engine. Just the cylinder block was the only part, of course, that we used. All the rest of it was made, the cylinder heads, crankshaft, conrods, everything else was manufactured by Repco. And that's the engine we used for the first year. And in the second year, we switched to our own cylinder block, and the Repco engine became a whole Repco engine in its entirety.
Designed by motorcycle legend Phil Irving, the single-cam Repco engine was reliable, lightweight, unstressed and economical, returning 7 miles per gallon. How did Brabham manage to prepare the car so quickly?
It wasn't too difficult to do because they were both V8 engines, and the Coventry Climax 1500 engine was quite a large engine. It was double overhead camshaft, and it was a bit on the bulky side, and the Repco engine, only having a single overhead camshaft cylinder head, didn't take up a lot more space actually than what the 1500 engine did. And that was part of our success, was that it went into the chassis very easily, and it was an extremely reliable, good engine with a lot of torque straight off, and the car was very successful.
That first success came in the International Trophy at Silverstone, and Brabham proved that the 3-litre Repco engine was competitive, including all that Ferrari and John Surtees could throw at it. Around the fast curves at Silverstone, Jack was proving that he'd lost none of his skill as a driver. In the 6 years since he'd won the World Championship, he was giving away nothing to younger men.
Jack was quite clever because during the period of the changeover from 1.5 litre to 3 litre, Jack got on the bandwagon, or got on the job very early, and got the Repco Brabhams built in Australia based on the Buick engine, and they were away. They basically had a suitable sized engine modified here in Melbourne, and just we got it going, and it went very, very well. Long before Ferrari managed to get their act together, and along came the Cosworths a year or two later.
Jack's first Grand Prix success in 1966 came at the French Grand Prix at Reims. The fast circuit was expected to favour the Ferraris and anyone else with more power than the 320 horsepower of the Repco. However, Brabham pulled away from the Ferrari to win the fastest Grand Prix ever.
Yes, I think that was probably one of the highlights of my career, really, because to win the French Grand Prix against the Ferraris and everything was, it was the sort of circuit where they reckon they couldn't be beaten anyway. And to beat the Ferraris there was quite an achievement. And the circuit itself was extremely fast and not really suited to the car, but the car performed so well. And win that race was a great achievement, I think, for Repco and the car.
At the British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch, Jim Clark, Graham Hill and Jackie Stewart were expected to put up a strong challenge on a damp track in the early stages. However, no one could challenge Brabham, who went straight into the lead and began to pull away. The road holding of the Brabham was absolutely superb as, behind him, everyone else scrabbled for grip. There was nothing that Jochen Rindt, John Surtees or the Coopers could do. Soon, Denny Hulme moved up behind Jack into second place. It was a Brabham 1-2 at Brands Hatch, the best result so far for Repco Brabham.
Yes, we had a 1-2 at Brands Hatch that year, yes. I think just the reliability of the engine, the torque of the engine, and the combination of the car that we had and the team of people we had behind us was just a very successful team.
With 2 wins behind them, the Brabham team arrived in Zandvoort, Holland for the Dutch Grand Prix. In a rare extrovert moment, Jack donned a beard and walking stick. The old man was prepared to put it across the younger guys, just as Fangio had done years before. Once again, the 3-litre Repco Brabham went into the lead at an early stage, and Jack went on to win his 3rd Grand Prix in a row. Jack was now favourite to win the World Championship, and he was getting great support from Denny Hulme. Next round was the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. The Nürburgring, as always, provided changeable weather, and in the latter part of the race it began to rain heavily. On the twists and turns of the 22-kilometre ring, Jack Brabham proved that he was not only a superb engineer and constructor, but probably the most underrated world champion of all time. These were the days before wings and ground effects, and Jack, on treaded tyres, teased it round the circuit in horrible conditions to take his 4th win in a row. The World Championship was almost within his grasp, and a 2nd place at the end of the season, once again in Mexico, clinched it for Brabham, the first and only man ever to take a World Championship title in a car of his own manufacture. The British Racing Drivers Club recognised the feat with a gold medal at their annual dinner at the Grosvenor Hotel. How did Jack Brabham maintain his competitiveness over so many years?
Yes, he certainly gave those indications that he... I think most people that drive racing cars are competitive people, and it comes out in whatever they choose to follow later.
And Jack was always there, and he we flew to a lot of meetings. Jack flew an aircraft like you drive a car, and we got in and fired up and limped off Fair Oaks over the glass houses and disappeared into the fog and hopefully landed, sometimes we almost found the airports. So it was a pretty interesting era. But I think they brought it in at one stage where they had graded drivers and ungraded drivers, never expecting an ungraded driver to win. And I think on a couple of occasions they took out the graded and the ungraded in Formula 2 for Jack. Not that I saw a great deal of the money, mind you. Jack invested it wisely for me.
At the end of the season, most of the European competitors went over to Australia for the Tasman Series. It was like an 8-round World Championship in 8 weeks. It was also the chance for Jack to meet up with the Repco staff, discuss plans for the new season and promote the company. Companies within the Repco organisation round the country supplied parts for the engines. Eventually, the distance from Melbourne to Europe became difficult to overcome. In the end, Repco couldn't equate the publicity of worldwide success with the costs of developing racing engines, and a great engineering opportunity was lost. At the same time, Jack started an association with Honda, which continues to this day. In 1966, Jack and Denny dominated Formula 2 with Honda-powered Brabhams. Jack was honoured as the Australian of the Year in 1966 and presented with a medal at Sandown in Melbourne. Into 1967, the success continued, although Denny Hulme's first Grand Prix win at Monaco was achieved in a race that claimed the life of Lorenzo Bandini.
Yes, I was having a good dice with Lorenzo Bandini, and I saw the accident and all the palaver that went with it. But the hype of me actually winning my first Grand Prix, I'd sort of put the Bandini accident behind me at the time. Yes, of course it was a sad day, but it was also very exciting for me to win my first Grand Prix at Monte Carlo.
There was a new engine rival for Repco on the scene, the Ford DFV. The DFV made its dream debut in the Dutch Grand Prix, Jim Clark taking the car to a maiden victory. The Brabhams were left behind, and many thought that this was perhaps the end of the Repco domination. The Belgian Grand Prix was also an exciting event, but only perhaps because this proved to be a win for ex-Brabham driver Dan Gurney in his Eagle. The French Grand Prix was business as usual for the Brabham team. The race was held at the short Bugatti circuit at Le Mans, and Jack took the win from Denny. It was clear that the battle for the championship would be between the two Brabham drivers. What they lacked in speed, they made up for in reliability. At the British Grand Prix at Silverstone, it was a typically gritty drive by Brabham, but he finished 4th to Jim Clark. Denny Hulme finished in 2nd place. It seemed that fortune was favouring Denny at this stage of the season. The teams moved on to the Nürburgring again. Clark was fastest in practice and the Ford DFV cars looked to be competitive. But this tough, hard circuit, which always brought out the very best in drivers, brought out every weakness in cars too. The Lotuses retired and Denny Hulme led the race with Brabham following closely behind. Again, it was a dominant performance. Jack had to give best to Denny on this occasion. His interests were primarily for the team and not necessarily in winning the championship for himself. But there were still close rivals in the championship. In the Canadian Grand Prix at Mosport Park, it was Brabham on a wet track showing everyone the way home. Behind him, Denny Hulme was 2nd.
Denny, although his background was more of a mechanic, he in fact, when he drove for us, acted more as a driver rather than part of the team operation. Now, Jack was, if I had any ideas, and I mentioned the Jack, he wouldn't give up until he tried them, whereas Denny took the things that had been adequately tested, and it gave him in 67, when they drove together, it gave Denny more reliability than Jack.
The Italian Grand Prix at Monza was perhaps the turning point of the season. John Surtees was at the wheel of the Lola-built Honda, a car which lacked the road holding to challenge on some circuits, but had the power on the fast Italian track to give its best. Once again, the Lotus Fords fell back. Out in front, it was a battle between Jack Brabham and Surtees. For lap after lap, they circulated in close company. And Jack was looking ready to pounce, as was often the case in the final stages of the race. On this occasion, he was to make a mistake which probably cost him the World Championship.
I don't think I'll forget it, ever. Actually, it was a race where the Honda was extremely quick, and for some reason I'd dropped back quite a bit, but I managed to catch him on the last lap and going down the back straight into the corner before the pits. I actually passed him on the inside, and the reason I was able to pass him on the inside, there was oil that had been dropped on the inside and somebody had put cement over it, and that left a line down the inside which people were avoiding. That was the only hole I had, and I went down that inside and got in the oil and couldn't quite stop enough for the corner, to be able to get a good line out of it. And John Surtees had a better line out of the corner, although I came out first. He had the run on me. And he just passed me by about the width of a tyre going over the line.
The crowd roared its approval at what was a fantastic race. In the final 2 rounds of the 1967 World Championship, Jim Clark and Graham Hill dominated at Watkins Glen, and Jack dropped back to 5th place. Clark finished ahead of Brabham at the Mexican Grand Prix, and Denny Helm took the championship with Jack Brabham a very close second.
Jack kept his ideas in his head, and basically, I suppose that was fairly good. He sort of sent all the information back to Australia, and you'd get on. You'd get the second best, but not really. Jack was quite fair, in actual fact. But if there was something new, and all I got to say is, in '67, when I won the championship, if Jack had stuck to, or kept some of the gear that I had, he probably would have won the championship. But he would try something new all the time, like maybe new camshafts, valves, or valve springs, or something like that, and occasionally they would break and let him down, and I had the good old reliable stuff, probably not the same horsepower, but reliable, and you've got to be there at the finish.
What was it like to beat your teammate to the World Championship that year, who also owned the team?
That wasn't easy, particularly when we got to Watkins Glen, and there was only Mexico City afterwards to go. The mechanics were even slightly divided within the team, and I think that even happens nowadays as well, when there's 2 good guys in one team trying to win the championship. Less of a problem in that we didn't have so many mechanics. There was 2 for me and 2 for Jack. But Jack, once again, was still giving himself the best parts, but then sometimes they were a bit fragile and weren't properly tested. So I probably had, in the end, the better opportunity to win the championship.
Well, Danny was an extremely good driver, and he was coming on at that stage, and he'd been in our team for a little while, and it was a real touch and go thing at the end of the year as to who was going to win the championship. We had 2 good cars, 2 good drivers, and we were finishing 1, 2 and right up the front all the time, but as it turned out in the end, Danny was first and I was second in the championship. But for Repco and the team, it was a good result. Well, 1968 was a bad year for us, really, because Repco decided they'd build a twin-cam engine similar to the Cosworth, and that engine didn't turn out anywhere near as successful as the first one. We had a few problems in the engine, mainly with a torsional crankshaft problem, which went through the engine. And by the end of that year, Repco decided they didn't want to go any further with it because it was starting to cost too much money and motor racing was starting to escalate, and the Ford Cosworth had come on the scene, and of course that was, I don't have to tell you how successful that engine was. And the following year, in '69, we switched to the Ford Cosworth engine ourselves.
Other drivers who drove for Brabham included Dan Gurney, Jackie Ickx and Jochen Rindt. What were Ron Turanak's impressions of them?
I was much closer to Rindt than the others. We actually roomed together during the year he drove for us, and he's a very likeable guy. Dan, of course, just flew in from America and did the race and went back again, so one didn't get the same relationship with him, but he was equally fast. Ickx, I would say, a strange person. I got along well with him, but he was a bit more like a spoilt schoolboy or a prima donna. I think when he was on his own, when Jack broke his ankle, he rose to great heights, and in fact in one classic race beat Stewart at, in Canada, Mosport Park. In fact, Stewart went off the road when he was being passed. So he could rise to those heights if he felt everything was behind him.
Jochen Rindt wanted to stay at Brabham, but Lotus made him an offer he couldn't refuse.
Told us when we were in Mexico in the last race of the previous season of this offer he'd had from Colin, and he didn't want to go, and in fact he said, look, I'll drive for you for half the money, I want to stay. But we weren't into getting sponsorship in those days. It was quite in fact I've never been into getting sponsorship. It's a different way of life and I'm not used to it. Money wasn't in the formula in those days. In fact, I think we, in those championship winning years, I think our total sponsorship was about £10,000. We got a bit from Goodyear and a bit from Esso, and that was our lot.
Times were hard, and perhaps Jack should have been thinking of retirement at 44 years of age. If he was, it didn't show in South Africa, where he took his first win of the 1970 season in the new monocoque car. It looked all season long as if Jack could win the championship for a fourth time.
Well, there's 3 races actually, more or less one after another, that I had a problem with. The first one, of course, I won in South Africa. And then in Spain, I got up to a point where I was about to pass Jackie Stewart with 10 laps to go, and I'd put a brand new Cosworth engine in to start the race with, and the crankshaft broke with 10 laps to go, and turned out to be a faulted crank, and just, you know, bad luck really, but there was one race that I should have won. And then the next one, of course, was Monaco, and I was leading right up the last lap, and Piers Courage had run out of petrol just before the last corner, and that was just one of those decisions. I took the wrong decision, went down on the inside of him instead of the outside of him, and of course all the sand was on the inside, and I just couldn't stop for the corner, and Rint got by me for the lead. And then of course Rint and I had a terrific dice at Brands Hatch at the British Grand Prix, and I managed to get the better of him with 10 laps to go, and on the last lap the car ran out of petrol in the last corner, and I rolled over the line second again.
Jack was probably, I would have thought, you know, people talk about various talents and stuff like that, but Jack had everything that you require for a professional driver. The bloke had, I've never run into a thick champion in my life. They don't exist. The bloke is a champion because he's thought his way there. It just doesn't happen the way that the storybooks would like you to believe it. And Jack got there through hard work, through his inventiveness. He's probably, before his time, he was probably the best lateral thinker I've ever run into. And talent-wise, as a driver on his day, he could beat anybody. I mean, I have seen him at Brands Hatch in a Cooper, and I've seen Moss and everybody there, and the accolades, and the Tony Brookses, and Alan Stacey's, and all people of that era, and they're all expounding their virtues, but it was Brabham that saw the checkered flag first. It's not luck. And he done it so many times, and he saw Mossy was the extrovert. He had the manager. He had the Ken Gregorys and all these people that were around, and they professionalised the business in the first place. Jack wasn't interested in that. He didn't have a manager. He went back to his workshop and started working his next thought while everybody else was doing the promotion. And we know these days that television is the answer. I mean, and it's how you look and what you are. If Greg Norman looked like the Hunchback of Notre Dame, he wouldn't get a camera on him.
Jack's complete record was 3 World Championships, 14 wins, 13 pole positions from 129 races over 15 years. His first and last wins came 11 years apart. Racing has changed, so it's impossible for anyone to drive and own a team these days. The fact that Jack has been the only one to achieve this makes him unique. The sport changed dramatically from the do-it-yourself racing of the 1950s through the specialised constructors or garagists of the 1960s to the sponsored entertainment of the 1970s. Racing changed too, from front-engine cars with skinny tyres to rear-wheel drive with wings and slicks. Jack was able to adapt to the changes in technique and circumstance, a remarkable achievement. After retiring from racing in 1970, Jack sold the team to Ron Turenak. After a tough year in 1971, Ron sold the team to Bernie Eccleston and had enjoyed 2 decades of success before disappearing from the Formula One scene. Jack was knighted in 1979. He stayed involved with his sons' racing careers. Jeff excelled in sports cars, David had 2 attempts in Formula One with Brabham and Simtek, while Gary was a versatile all-rounder.
Goals at the moment is to qualify and to finish the race. Just get the first race under my belt and learn as much as possible for the next race.
Very, very pleased about it as well. And, you know, as David said, he hasn't joined the team just because of his name. He's in there because of his results and his ability. And that makes it even better.
Sir Jack remains the elder statesman of world champions. He still competes and makes public appearances, a revered figure. Sir Jack Brabham, a true legend of motor racing.